Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
A government watchdog is sounding the alarm about a growing national security threat, one that comes from the everyday digital traces service members and their families leave online. A new Government Accountability Office report warns that publicly accessible data, from social media posts and location tracking to routine Defense Department press releases, can be pieced together by bad actors to identify military personnel and disrupt military operations. GAO says the Pentagon has taken some steps to address the threat, but its efforts remain scattered and lack coordination. For more, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Joe Kirschbaum, director of the Defense Capabilities and Management Team at GAO.
We did the study in response to the Congressional Defense Committee's interest. They really wanted us to help them find out where the Department of Defense was on this kind of diverse threat, this threat of publicly available information. It's different from cyber threats itself and in the individual parts of information security. Obviously, the department deals with that stuff all the time. But this is wide enough and broad enough. And although we were looking at in response to the Armed Services Committees, looking at the military, this is also an issue that affects absolutely everyone in society. So it's a much broader issue. And the Congressional Defense Committees wanted to get a sense for where the department was on this. We've done work before on topics similar to this. So, for example, like the Internet of Things and potential weaknesses and vulnerabilities of that. And we found that the department they recognized that there were security issues, but they weren't necessarily well prepared to respond to them because it was new, because it didn't necessarily neatly fit into existing organizational structures or policies or doctrines. And that's a consistent story with the department. So that's why the defense committees were really interested in us following up on this.
Could you walk us through an example of how a bad actor could identify service members using publicly available information, how that information can be exploited, and what types of security risks that creates?
One of the things we did was we used some of the data that we were able to find publicly available and kind of created notional threat scenarios. And the one that you mentioned was threats from personal information to DoD personnel or potential risks. And so one of the things we did, we started to look at what information might be out there. We did that in several ways, one of which is to generally what kind of information is available. We also did the next best thing to creating our own version of a potential threat profile. In other words, we had our own investigators. These were qualified investigators that actually go to the web, and they actually also looked at the deep web and the dark web to find potential information that could be available. And what they found was that in addition to the basic tweets and Facebook posts and things like that are commonly out there, you don't have to dig very far into those other portions of the web to find things such as data brokers selling information on DoD members and their family, personal information, operational information. And once you start putting some of these things together, potentially, you start to see patterns, whether it's looking at individuals, whether it's the individuals linked to military operational units or operations themselves, family members. And so nefarious actors can take these things and build them into a profile that can be used for nefarious purposes.
You focused on OSD and DoD components' efforts to mitigate security risks and threats and protect personal information from exploitation. What did you find there?
So this was, as I mentioned before, this is a kind of a common story that what we found in the past. And it goes, the story basically is that the Department of Defense recognizes many of the issues that we found as potential risks. And this is not uncommon for them to recognize that there are dangers of people posting too much information. So this is the kind of thing that several disciplines in the department have long recognized. So for example, the people that do what's called operations security in the department, that's the safety and security of DoD operations. It's the old loose lip sink ship idea. Anything that may potentially compromise the military operation is of importance and worth consideration. So we looked and we talked with people that deal with operations security. We looked at several of the other security-related enterprises and organizations in DoD, the people that do, for example, counterintelligence, that do force protection, which is kind of what the old term for anti-terrorism force protection, kind of protecting against attacks, insider threat programs, what's called mission assurance, making sure that military programs, equipment, whatever, can continue to run if attacked, and also some other areas like protection of critical program information related to contractors and DoD systems. We looked at all of those to see how they treated this issue. And the answer in general, except for the operations security folks, the answer was they didn't really consider these kind of publicly available information in their own sphere. It's not like they didn't recognize there was an issue, but it was more like, oh, yeah, that's a problem, but I think it's handled in these other areas. Almost like passing the buck. They didn't understand necessarily where it was handled. And the answer was it should probably be handled collectively amidst this entire structure. Now, the good news for the Department of Defense is this loose structure of security disciplines, they coordinate, they collaborate, and they do it regularly and they do it well. They have the kind of structures we would want to see in terms of coordination and risk management. They understand how to assess problems, collectively assign responsibilities to deal with them, to develop action plans. And from our perspective, the biggest bang for the buck, assess those action plans and see if they're making progress and then make changes. They've got that structure. So there was a good news, bad news story. The rest of the bad news story is we did not see where this particular issue of the threats and the vulnerabilities of publicly available information is adequately incorporated into their collective understanding.
Just like you said, DoD has identified the public accessibility of digital data as a real and growing threat. But again, action remains limited. And in your conversations with them, how do they explain the gap? Is it just like you said, oh, someone else is handling that?
I think in a large degree it is that it's a tendency. It's kind of like I've always said in the cyber world. There's a huge, enormous cultural aspect of it. It's not just technology. It's not just security policies. And by cultural, I mean, once again, we're talking about the military, but this goes for everyone in society. The cultural aspect is that everyone, absolutely everyone, is responsible for cybersecurity. And in this case, absolutely everyone is responsible for information and digital security. It's a matter for the department to help convince everyone of that, whether it's individual responsibilities. Now, these disciplines that are responsible for doing that, they have to take on the burden of ensuring that culture gets energized, as it were. And so what we've seen in the last several years, and I'll use the example that I talked about a few months ago about the Internet of Things. So we issued a report in 2017 about some of the threats and vulnerabilities of some of these systems like Fitbits and things like that that are transmitting data. And from the Department of Defense's perspective, well, that data is not transmitted on a DoD network, so it wasn't necessarily considered a threat. And our response was, well, are you concerned that that information might be used by an adversary? And so people like the operations security folks, they did recognize that was a potential issue. So and in 2018, there was the revelations that those Fitbits were, in fact, being allowed to track military personnel at facilities overseas in the United States. So DoD very rapidly came out with regulations that governed how Fitbits were supposed to be used and what parameters they could be used by military personnel. So that's a good example of the fact that they could respond rapidly, but it's also an example that it's reactive. When there's an issue, they can respond. What we're trying to see is that next level of thinking about this as a holistic issue. Where does this challenge fit across those security disciplines? Because the truth is the technology changes all the time and it changes rapidly. It's probably going to change faster than you can react to it. So thinking about it a little bit more proactively is probably a good idea.
In the report, the officials cited that the Secretary of Defense's 2025 priorities, like reviving warrior ethos, rebuilding capabilities, deterrence, etc., as the reasons why digital profile risk hasn't been elevated. From GAO's perspective, how does digital profile risk actually fit into the same priorities?
One of our perspectives on this is we know we're not sure where you would put this topic in terms of those priorities. I mean, this is a pretty clear case where it's a threat to the stability and efficacy of our military forces. So that kind of underlines all priorities. You can't necessarily defend the homeland with forces that have maybe potential operational security weaknesses. So it would seem to kind of undergird all of those priorities. So that's kind of way I think we would view it. We also respect the fact that as the department's making tough choices, whether it's concentrations of policy, financial, and things of that nature, they do have to figure out where the most immediate ways to apply dollars. So, for example, if we're asking the department really to look across all those security disciplines and more thoroughly incorporate these threats in that existing process, the extent they're going to have to make investments in those, they do have to figure out what needs to be done first and where this fits in. So that doesn't negate that, but I would think this will be a consideration for the broader military about how they're able to affect all of those priorities.
That's Joe Kirschbaum, Director of the Defense Capabilities and Management Team at GAO, speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com.